I'm Julie Lyles Carr, and you're listening to the Modern Motherhood Podcast from All Mom Does, an online community of support, inspiration, ideas, and tools for your life, from your relationships to your kids to your work. Check out allmomdoes.com and on the socials to find friendship and connection with women in your season of life. Check out this awesome review for the podcast from E. Bernhardt. She writes, Julie spoke at a retreat I attended recently. Excellent speaker, by the way. And I decided to check out her podcast. The episodes I've listened to have been professional, timely, and full of love for her listeners. Great content. Thanks for serving, Julie. E. Bernhardt, thank you so much. Such gracious words, and I really appreciate it. And hey, friends, I'd love to feature your 5-star rating and review on an upcoming episode, just like we've done with E. Bernhardt. So be sure and leave those shiny stars and happy reviews wherever you get your podcast, and your rating and review really does help other people find the content we're sharing here. I'm really excited for you to hear this episode today. This is a woman I admire so much and feel so thankful to call a friend. She's lived all over the world. She's lived on the mission field. She's homeschooled and raised 5 kids. And she has been so intentional and thoughtful to speak life and hope to others, to use her influence well when God put her family, and especially her son, pro football and now baseball star Pam Tebow, in the national spotlight. Today, I welcome my friend, Pam Tebow. Thank you for being with us today.
Oh, you're welcome, Julie. I'm thrilled to be here.
So I'm assuming that pretty much all of my listeners are going to know who you are, but just in case they don't, tell us about you, about your husband, about your kids, where you live, all those kind of things.
Well, I've been married a long time to my husband, Bob. He's in ministry. His ministry has varied over the years, but it's mostly been abroad in Asia. He's an evangelist, so he loves to share the gospel, and he brings lots of kids on mission trips. We have an orphanage and a safe house and hospital and lots of things that God has enabled us to do over the years. And so he's kind of outside the box, as are a lot of my kids. So I have 5 kids. I have Christy, Katie, Robbie, Peter, Timmy. And Timmy might be the best known. He's not my favorite. I always tell my kids that I don't have a favorite. He's just probably the most well known of my kids because of his just different ventures, including football. And I have 8 grandchildren, and
Wow.
number 9 is on the way. So
Yay.
That's a great joy. It's a wonderful season in life. So I'm just thrilled. I love my family so much, and I'm happy to talk about them.
8, almost 9 grandbabies.
Yes.
All right. Goals. So why Asia? Why was Asia the place that God put on your hearts? What about Asia?
What a great question. Well, my husband, actually, we met in college because he started a group called Campus Crusade on our campus at the University of Florida the year before I came. And it's now called Cru, but I came along and was discipled through Cru, and I met him and thought when I first met him that he was crazy and he was fanatical. And then, God just drew us together, and I married him, and we had an adventure, went off to grad school. He has degrees, and it was fun just learning to live by faith. So God gave me a lot of practice in that, which really helped when we went to the mission field. But we began to have our kids, and then my husband came up with the crazy idea of homeschooling before it was a word, before anyone did it. Nobody talked about it because it wasn't done, and we'd never heard of any homeschooler. And it was quite a challenge for me because I thought if I submitted to him that God would surely change his mind. But 25 years later, I got to retire. But, God had a plan for that because he was a pastor at the time, and he thought that was what we needed to do. A couple of years later, God called us to the mission field. My husband had been on a mission trip as a pastor with a group of pastors, and he just had the time of his life. He led all these people to Christ and started a couple of churches, then came back and went back to his church, and then he was traveling, and God just, my husband says in an inaudible voice, spoke very loudly to him that he was calling him to go to the mission field. And God was so gracious because at the same time, I was home in bed and had 4 little kids, and God clearly called me too. And I did not respond as immediately as my husband. I wrestled with the Lord through the night, just saying, Lord, but what about this and what about that? And then finally, I gave in. I'd been memorizing a verse. Ah, Lord God, behold, you've made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. Nothing is too difficult for you. So I thought, well, if God created the world, then nothing's too difficult for him. He can handle this. So I went to sleep, and my husband returned the next day, and he told me about what God did. And I said, I know. He called me too. And it was gracious of God to do that because we had a lot of challenges. So we took our kids to the mission field, and God knew we would need homeschooling because we went 2 years after we started homeschooling, and I had practice and I had curriculum, and I was a little bit more prepared, not greatly prepared, but at least I was a little more prepared. And so he knew that. He also knew that we would have 2 dyslexic kids. That's a challenge. I would never have wanted them to be criticized in school, made fun of because they couldn't read early, and they've done fine. They've gone to college, and Timmy writes about dyslexia in his books because he wants to encourage all those kids that think maybe God made a mistake with them, and yet it's just because God wired them differently.
Right.
Because they're different thinkers, and they're able to do things and see things differently than maybe someone else does. And I should have known my husband's dyslexic, so it just one of my granddaughters
followed on down. Yeah.
But my granddaughter just tells everybody she's dyslexic, and she names every famous person that's ever been dyslexic, including her Uncle Timmy. So anyway, we've learned a lot, though, through the years about how God has taken care of us. And he's just been such a faithful God. He gave us a home and a ministry on the mission field. And my husband's heart is just so drawn to the people, especially in the Philippines, because they're so responsive to the gospel. They're very gracious, loving people. And it's funny, I encounter them everywhere I go, and it's an immediate attraction.
Right.
They know we love them,
connection,
and we do. I'm drawn to them. They're drawn to us. My husband has about 70 national staff that work for him, and they're doing so many things in the Philippines, good things.
Right.
And then he was in the Philippines in 1991, and they were going to throw a baby in the river. And so he wondered, do we start an orphanage? And that was the beginning of our orphanage. So we've had orphans that we've cared for all these years.
Right.
And so we've loved that ministry, and then it's spread a little. We do ministry in another Asian country that we can't really name because it would endanger the people there. But my husband had a chance to buy back some. Actually, there were little girls from the sex slave industry,
right? And
he thought, how can I not? He took out all of his money and bought them, and then, that just grew and grew. There were more and more girls, and so what are you going to do? So we have a safe house that our son's foundation helped to build, helped to finance. And so we're just, you never know what God's going to do.
Right.
And
you can't, might be.
Yes, you cannot even believe how the Lord is just, you couldn't see at the beginning what God's going to do as you proceed. So we're so grateful. And our kids are all involved in that. They grew up going to the mission field, and, they lived on the mission field. And then and Timmy was born in the Philippines, and then going on mission trips.
Right.
So they all love it. They have a heart for it. They love to go back. They're involved in a lot of different ministries. And actually, one of the results is that our oldest daughter, Christy, and her husband, Joey, and their kids are in ministry, and they're on the mission field.
That's
they're
right. I remember that.
In Asia, in South Asia. So we're so thankful for them and how God has called them and the job they're doing there.
Right.
So it just, that's a ripple effect, of our hearts. And then we don't even know that we're demonstrating to our kids, how God can take care of us, and they watch you trust God. In fact, that was one of the greatest joys, I think, in my life, is that when my daughter announced that God was calling her husband and her, the time they didn't have kids, to go to the mission field, she said, Mom, Joey and I can't wait to trust God for the mission field like you and Daddy did. Wow. Because they watched us, and we had a lot of crazy adventures, but God always came through. Right. And they watched that. They watched us. Just was all we could do at times to just believe that God was going to take care of the issue, whatever it was, whether it was finding us a home that seemed impossible on a primitive island, or Timmy's birth story, which is another God story. And so they really believed God would write great God stories for them. And he is.
Right.
He is. He is.
So how do you think the experience of living in the Asian culture for your kids? Because, they're kind of from two cultures in a sense.
They are. That's right.
They've got this American culture, but they also have this Asian Filipino culture. How do you see that that's played out as they have launched into adulthood and launched into their own families? How did that change the dynamic of your family?
I think that they were not as excited about material things. It's not that they don't want a nice home. And, Timmy never even bought a car. He let people donate for whatever reason. But, it didn't hold as much value to them as it might for someone else. And we're so glad, because I think they saw a lot of Filipinos that were just so happy, and people in other countries that maybe they didn't have a lot, but they had joy.
Right.
And they knew the Lord, and they were happy, and they were, in their eyes, they had everything they needed. Mm-hmm. So I think they began to realize that it isn't as critical that we have the latest and greatest. And so we're glad. Not that we don't all like that. I'm not discounting that.
Right.
But we don't have to make us happy. That isn't the key to happiness and joy.
They learned that early on, right?
Yeah, they really do. And you have to learn contentment. That's something we really tried to encourage them to be content, whatever state they were in. But that's hard sometimes.
Right.
But I really believe that's what Paul said. It's not easy. It's something we learn.
Exactly.
So
to live in that place of contentment.
Yes, you do. You have to. And I'm not saying that's the easy way to go.
Right.
And I didn't sign up for that, but that's what God had for our family.
What was it like for them when they began to come back into the U.S. and integrate into this culture again, and sort of become aware afresh in many ways of, oh, okay, so...
Wow, I tell you what, I think it was hard. I knew what I was getting into. I knew that I would go from a slow-paced culture to a crazy culture that is so demanding, and we have so many distractions. And as moms, there's so many things we could do with our kids. In fact, we're always on the run, and we're going here and we're going there, and you could just put them in a zillion sports and all these activities. And that's really hard, because you still want to have kids get, they get overtired, exhausted from all of those activities. And I think they need some time to think, and they need quiet, and it's hard to balance that. I mean, it's much harder in American life, because the balance is so hard to get. So I really struggled with that, and coming back to the U.S. and trying to integrate everybody into the culture. Of course, there's wonderful privileges and, opportunities that you don't have living in a foreign country. So we wanted to take advantage of those.
Right.
But they're challenges.
Right, right. And trying to discern wisely.
That's right.
What all they should be in and what they should be doing.
Right.
And there's so much decision fatigue, I think, in a sense.
That's right.
I often get emails from moms who listen to the podcast or know me from other venues, and they're all searching for sort of that formula for figuring out, well, what should I have my kids in? How busy should I have them? So what do you see, looking back, were the most beneficial things that you did have the kids engaged in, or the things that you intentionally said no to, depending on where you were, if you were in the States or in the Philippines? What are the things now that you go, wow, that was of great benefit, and oh, that's something I probably wouldn't have done again?
Well, we tried to go by their interest and their abilities. And so we would just pray and try to discern. Our oldest daughter had an interest in music. And so that's a long story that I talk about in my book, because God wrote a special story for her. But he also provided people to teach her piano. He provided pianos along the way. And God really made it very clear that that was his plan for her. Music was a big part of her life. So that was her interest. It wasn't necessarily everyone's. But we decided we would give everybody a chance to try music. And, her sister Katie loved the flute, not piano. So she went in that direction. And it was pretty hopeless with the boys, We gave them all an opportunity. Our son Peter's probably more musical, but it was just hysterical. I still picture Timmy taking piano, and it was just cute. We all laugh about that, and he's not going to be offended if he hears this, because there's just some things people are not gifted for. But it was fun. But we let them try.
Yeah.
And then the same was true of sports. We did not go overboard and let them do every single sport. Whenever they wanted to. We had to still have family time, and we had to have time for school, and we had to keep some kind of balance. And oh my goodness, we struggled with that, but we realized that some had a real gift in a sport, but we wanted them to have the opportunity.
Right.
I've met grown men that just almost have tears in their eyes when they come up to me and they said, my mother never let me play football. She was so afraid I'd get hurt. Yeah. Well, I think every one of our kids got hurt. They all have their stories, but it's a guy thing. Yeah. My husband played football, and he just, so they all had that opportunity, and that ended up to be a favorite sport, and baseball, right. And they still tease their dad that they never played soccer because that wasn't his sport.
See, all of mine, it's been soccer.
Yeah,
my husband is a huge soccer fan.
Now it's popular. And our grandkids play soccer. They all play soccer, and I still don't understand it, but I see them running around and they have a great time. But
wears them out. It's good.
My kids have the best time. Say, Dad, you never let us play soccer, but they played the other sports, and that was fun. So we did do sports, but there were times when they couldn't overdo it. They played this ball. For instance, Robbie's senior year, he was an outstanding baseball player, and we said to Timmy, you know what? He could play 6th grade ball, and we still homeschooled, but they could play at the school by then. And he made the team, but we said, you know what? This is your brother's senior year, and you need to support him. We're all going to go support him, and you can play park ball. But let's just take a break from that. And he was willing. And then you began to understand that you support your siblings, that we're all going to support what everybody does. Somebody has a piano recital, and whether or not you love to listen to the piano, we're all going to go.
Right.
We're all going to go to graduations. We're all going to go to the ball games. We're all going to support everybody. It's not just one, that's that kid's thing. No, it's our family's thing.
See, and that leads right into something I wanted to talk to you about. And I think that sets a great platform to understand what happened next. Because, when you have kids who have excelled in something, and I've got a couple who within their little areas of things that they love, they've gotten some notoriety and some attention for what they've done. And of course, we've got Tim's story where it just went so big in terms of football and now baseball. How did you navigate those waters with your family on trying to make sure that a jealousy might not come up or a competitiveness might not come up, not because you were pushing or showing favoritism, but just the amount of attention sometimes that can get paid onto a kid who is getting a lot of acclaim for what they're doing. Or the corollary that I've experienced too is if there is a child in a family who's differently abled, and that child's needs take a lot of attention of the family, a lot of the resources of the family. And sometimes you'll talk to individuals that really resent that sibling who was kind of known as the golden child, or that sibling that took up a lot of the family's energy and attention because of the different needs that they might have had. So how do we navigate those waters well as moms to make sure that when we've got one who's excelling in their thing and they get a lot more public attention, or we've got one that just requires a lot more of our attention, that we don't leave the other siblings maybe feeling like, well, what about my thing? What about the flute concert?
I struggled with it, to be honest. And I'm sure that moms that are listening struggle too. And I really prayed about it because I felt like I grew up in a situation where there was some favoritism. So I was so adamant about not showing favoritism to my kids. And I can remember, our oldest daughter excelled at piano, but then there's my second born. And that just she didn't want to do the same thing as her sister. And I can understand that. She wanted to be her own person. I remember kneeling by my bed, and that's not necessary to kneel, but I just crying out to the Lord, begging him, okay, I want to make my second born feel so special. Lord, I don't know what to do. Will you please help me? I mean, I can remember it so vividly. And God is so gracious. The next week in the mail, my daughter received a flute. Now that is a direct answer to prayer. And I didn't realize that years before, my daughter, we had good friends when we lived in the Philippines. They came to visit us, and my friend played the flute, and Katie secretly told her desire was to play the flute. She never told that to me.
Oh, wow.
So it was that week following my prayer that my friend felt compelled to send her flute to my daughter, Katie. I mean, she got it, and she was so excited. And there was a wonderful flute teacher at our church, and she bonded with Katie. And, the story goes on. She actually got a flute scholarship. I mean, it's such a God story because I never would have thought of that on my own. And I would just encourage every mom to go to the Lord because He loves our kids more than we do.
Right.
I mean, I see myself as so inadequate at times. I mean, I'm so desperate for God to intervene because I don't have the answer. I don't have the wisdom. I don't have the big picture, but God does. And He just loved my little girl so much. And that just meant the world to her because it was her unique thing. She played in the church orchestra. She did her own thing. She wasn't compared to her sister, which is so important.
Right.
And I didn't want people to compare. And people do that, know.
Right.
And we need to all make sure we do not compare one person to the other. Scripture even says, don't compare yourself by yourself, And that's true. It's especially true for mothers. They need to know, every kid needs to know that their mom loves them special and that she sees their strong suits, to She sees their potential long before they do. And you have to communicate that to them. You have to ask God for wisdom. What to see in your kid. What do you see in your kid? Mm-hmm. No one else may see that, but you have the ability, I think, as a mother, and to really speak into your kid's life and give them courage, maybe to do something different that they ordinarily wouldn't have the courage to do. And, you see their giftings and their abilities. And my husband was very involved as well.
Right.
So God is so gracious.
Well, and I think that willingness to retire our agenda.
Yes.
Because, we laugh about, your kids saying, we never got to play soccer because it wasn't Bob's thing. But to really, I've known moms who are just insistent that all of their children will play piano. Yeah. And then if you have one, like Timmy, who, that's
we
not
still
his
laugh
thing.
At that,
the unintentional side effect when you force a kid to do something that really is not their deal is they will start comparing themselves to how their siblings are doing.
That's right.
Even to be very cautious about grade reports and how a kid is doing, in terms of their grades,
true.
To do the best we can, to not set our kids up and not to make those statements that sometimes we make because we're tired and we're frustrated, but why can't you just blah, blah, blah like your brother? Why can't you like your sister? To do a really intentional job to remove those kind of phrases from our mothering vernacular, because the long-term ripple effect of that can be so negative.
That's right.
So negative. We want to send out those positive ripple effects. We'll be back with our conversation with Pam Tebow in just a moment. But first, you can help end trafficking through World Concern. Over 1 million. That's the number. Over 1 million children are trafficked in the world's poorest places, and that number can sound really overwhelming, but there is something you can do to help. On May 11th, join World Concern for the SOS 5K in Seattle. You and your family can run for a cause, whether that's actually hitting the pavement with us or by donating to help stop child trafficking worldwide. The SOS 5K is a number that can help end the number of over 1 million children who are trafficked. Go to sos5k.org to register or to donate today. That's the World Concern SOS 5K in Seattle, Washington, May 11th. Make a difference by going to sos5k.org. So you've got a new book. In addition to a 9th grandbaby on the way, now you've got a book baby. It's just about to hit the world. So what was that process like, trying to think through these years of mothering, of working with young women, of mentoring, and trying to say, okay, this is what I want to say to this next generation?
Well, it really helped that I've been speaking on this topic, and it's basically influence. How do we impact the lives around us? And I've been thinking and praying and speaking on this topic for years. So it's really my life message. I first started thinking about it in college because I knew nothing about my faith. My story of how I came to know the Lord is really a God story, because I walked all by myself to church when I was 12, and I never had been in church. I never heard a Bible study. And I walked with my little sister, and in that church I heard that God loved me. And he loved me so much that he sent his only son to die on the cross for me. And I prayed and asked Jesus to be my savior, but I knew nothing else. My parents wouldn't let me go back. So when I went to college, everything was new to me. I knew one verse. I went to this Bible study. I learned a little bit, and I went back to my sorority house where I lived, and I taught that to the girls around me because I was so excited about it. And I just learned a little bit, and I taught the little bit that I knew to them. And then week after week, the same thing happened, and I realized that God just grew us all. And that was my first exposure to positive influence. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, my life counts now. I'd never seen that before. I never thought that my life had purpose, that my life could count. But investing in somebody else, that made it count. Mm-hmm. And I had real influence for the first time ever. So I never wanted to stop that. And I saw that really multiply when I was a mother. I did other things. I did Bible studies and impacted women, but to impact my children, that just was my heart, because that's our role. No matter what season we're in, the ages of our kids, we can still speak life into them. We have such an impact on them. And it makes a difference long term. Mm-hmm. So that was my biggest audience, and what I talk a lot about and how I practiced. And so I was writing down my stories all along. So I just didn't have to sit down and think of what am I going to write about? That's my message. And as I began speaking, that was my topic so often. So I wrestled with, the outline. What are the most important things you can talk about? What's the foundation for influence? How do you think through it? And have some fun illustrations, because I had to learn from the beginning to what really works. How are you the most effective? And so it's a learning process for me as well. And, I share that too. And it's a lot of fun stories along the way, because we all have the opportunity to be influential, no matter where we're planted in life. And it doesn't matter what season we're in, whether we're young or we're old. Kids can have influence, and we wanted our kids to be intentional about the way they lived so that their lives mattered and they could impact the people in their sphere. And all of you that are listening, whether, you're in a classroom or whether you're in an office or whether you're at home with kids, we all have that same opportunity. My mother was 70 when my daughters talked to her about how she could have purpose and influence. And she never felt like her life counted before. And it's one of my favorite stories, because after they talked to her and they said, Grandma, you're in all these clubs. You can use your influence there. You love to write cards. Her gifting is very different. She was kind of shy, and yet she loved to write cards to people. So they said, you could write a little verse and ask people if they had prayer requests. And the most amazing things happened. They started a prayer chain in some of these club newsletters, and then people started sharing their answers to prayers, and then they took out a whole time at each meeting for women to share, and it just changed everything.
Right.
And it changed her life.
Yeah.
So she woke up excited every morning until the time she was 86, because she had purpose.
She had purpose.
And that's what we all need. We all need to know we have purpose. And if we invest in lives, even one life at a time, we're having purpose.
I think sometimes we think that it's got to be some one big
scale.
Splash.
Yes,
a big splash. And then we see waves break out from that. But I love this notion.
The little ripples.
Right. The title being ripple effects, because
small
those are the building blocks of waves. And we don't often realize that enough of those build up against each other. And then, you do have something that ultimately seems big, but it has to start sometimes with just that willingness to invest a small pebble of time and see what happens
one person.
next. Right.
Yeah, and then they do it with the next person and the next person.
And I would say that whether we're being intentional about it or not, whether we're choosing to be positive with it or not, we are all influencing someone all the time.
That's right.
I mean, I can remember I worked in a hardware store when I was in college. They called me the hardware honey.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I can remember if I had somebody come through my line or ask for a question or whatever, and they were a pleasant person, the ripple effect through the rest of my day was feeling like, okay, this is not my penultimate love job here, but okay, I had a better day. And if somebody came through and they were negative or really critical or very difficult, it had a ripple effect on the rest of my day as well. And so how can we make sure that we're grabbing hold of the understanding that we're always in a place of influence and the responsibility to be appropriate with that?
I really believe that we have to think through it. I pray, and having my time with the Lord in the morning, I just ask the Lord to make me see my opportunities. Don't let me miss them. There was a girl in the hotel when I checked in yesterday, and nobody talks to her and asks her about herself. Well, I wanted to, I asked her about herself, and she just lit up. So I came back down later, and she was there, and she couldn't hardly wait to talk to me because I knew her name.
Right.
And I knew something about her, and no one notices her. They don't see her. And I think that's true of so many people, that people aren't noticed. No one's interested in them. And we get to be that person. Ask them a question, or, it's different with moms. You've got all your little people around that you influence. But I think it's more than that. I think it's that if we think about it as we go to wherever we're going during our day, we can think about the people along the way, that each one of the people that God allows us to connect with really needs to have positive influence. And those ripples, they go on into eternity, especially if you're able then to have a relationship with someone and you can talk to them about a relationship with the Lord. I mean, that impacts them for eternity.
Right.
So we have a great, not just privilege, but I feel like it's a responsibility. Why are we created? Well, God expects us to have a discipleship type of ministry, and it can be small. It doesn't have to be huge.
Right.
But it can start out, look at Jesus and his disciples. There were just a few of them, and they changed the world.
They did. And it was just a handful of people.
That's right, a handful of people. And we can be world changers too, just in our soft manner. And we don't have to be any different than we are. God uses our giftings, our personality, our season in life, wherever we're located. We don't have to change all that. God uses all that, and we can impact the people in that sphere that we're in.
Right. That's what Paul says in Acts 16, right? When he tells the Athenians,
exactly.
God places people in specific times, eras, epochs, and geographies so that people will maybe have the chance to reach out for God. I think the other thing that's kind of fascinating to think about too is we think about influencing our children and being very direct in that influence. But the way that we use our influence and they watch us use our influence toward others,
that's a great point,
can have such effect.
Great point.
My husband Mike is really good about any restaurant we go to, or if we're at the grocery store, or whatever. He's always very intentional to meet who that person is who's serving us, to introduce that person to everyone around the table. And I'm watching now, generationally,
your kids
my kids doing it too.
I love that, Julie.
And then I watch their friends laugh about it, but then start doing it too. And it becomes this thing
that's the ripple effect.
It is the ripple effect. And it's this thing that Mike didn't sit our kids down and say, here's what I want you to do when we go to a restaurant.
Kids are always watching.
They're watching. And so what are things that you think women need to be aware of in terms of their influence, positive or negative, that another generation is watching closely, that we want to be really mindful of about how to speak into the next generation, even if it's not directly to the generation that they're watching?
Well, I really wanted and I know this may seem old-fashioned, but I wanted my kids to know Scripture. And I think early on there weren't a lot of books that I could go to, and I was desperate. I was a desperate mom. I didn't have the answers for anything hardly, so I kept going to God's manual because I needed it. And I thought, well, when my kids leave home, then I want them to have verses in their head because that has more impact than just my words alone or their dad's words alone, as powerful as they are. So we memorized a lot of Scripture, and I wanted to make it fun. And I heard years ago that what's learned in song is remembered long. So we put the Scripture to silly little tunes because I wanted it to stick in their heads. And, I think it still does. Mm-hmm. And some of my kids are still doing it now with their kids. Not everybody wants to sing their verses, and I get that. But they remember them. And I love to share that with moms because I think it's a simple little tool. But you teach them things that really impact their lives. For instance, my little boys played ball. And they would always brag about hitting a home run or scoring a touchdown. And you don't want to have kids that brag. You see too many athletes that are all about themselves and they want to say they're the greatest and the best. We didn't want our boys to be like that. So I found a verse. Let another praise you, not your own mouth. Let another praise you, not your own mouth. Let another praise you, not your own mouth. Stranger, not your own lips. And we memorized that and we talked about it, and they realized that later on when people asked them, why don't you talk about yourself? In fact, a reporter asked Timmy one time, and I read it in the newspaper because boys don't share the details like girls do. You know what I mean? I'm sure you've experienced that. So I read it in the newspaper that he said, well, when I was young, he said, why don't you talk about yourself? Why don't you ever, it's hard to get anything out of you. And he said, well, when I was young, my mom taught me a verse. And we sung it together. We talked about it. And let somebody else praise you. Don't talk about yourself. Don't brag. Don't tell people that. But we also knew that they had the desire to at least tell interested people about how they did. And so we alerted a few people at church, a few close friends, and they loved being in on it. So after Saturday games, they would go to church just bubbling over, and our friends would say, how did yesterday's game go? And then they could tell them,
right.
in a humble way. They could tell them. But, that impacted them forever.
Right.
And then they impact, think about the little boys that Timmy's impacted because he's not doing that on the major stage. And so he's impacting little boys. I mean, it's something simple like that.
Right.
But we did a lot of that because, like I said, I was a desperate mom, really wanting and not exactly knowing how to teach my kids truth, but I wanted the truth to stick.
Right.
And I feel like that's one of the most effective things that we did as a family. And, I love it. And now our kids are doing it with their
still
kids.
See that effect today.
I do.
Not as spiritual. I still remember my phone number from kindergarten.
Did you make it to put it to
Yes, my dad taught us to 4936990, and I won't tell you the last digit because it's now like this, when you have to have a PIN number or something.
Oh yeah, got it. Oh yeah, I won't.
But it's like a number that I can always remember.
Isn't
because
that
he set
funny?
it to tune. And I was laughing the other day because one of the kids needed to get into something that had a PIN number, and I was like, oh, and I sang it to him, and like that's how they're remembering it. I'm thinking, That is so funny. I mean, that is
Isn't
from
that fun?
kindergarten, something
Yes.
my dad taught me that now, even in a today, he never could have imagined that I would jump on a computer and have access
right.
to this
Ripple
kind of
effect.
service. Exactly. That phone number, he just wanted to make sure that if I got lost on my way home from school, I could
so
tell somebody where to
clever.
call.
I love that.
But here we are all these years later, and it's something that actually unlocks different information and portals that we need to get into for certain
That's
things.
what I need to do with my passwords.
Yeah, there you go.
Put him to a tune. And I have to preface it by saying that I don't have a good voice and I'm not musical. I couldn't write music if I tried, but that isn't required.
Right.
And I copy tunes.
Right.
I borrow them from other things, and it doesn't really matter if it sticks in your head. Just think of all the jingles you remember from,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It carries forward.
Yeah, it
and
does.
you just never know how far it might reach.
Exactly true. That's true.
So in this season of life, you're getting that beautiful experience of seeing things that you planted early on, not knowing exactly how it might end up, but you're seeing now where those things land. Except they don't land, right? I mean, when it comes to a ripple effect, it just keeps spreading out. So there will be things that'll be a generation from now, or 2 generations from now, or 3 generations from now. For you in your heart, what would you love for some of those things to be? I'm talking great grandkids, or whatever.
I'd love that. I want them to be honoring the Lord, to just stand for that. We have a heart for missions. I love that they're all about that. All of them love missions, but they do it in a different way. And we don't want them to be cookie cutters. We want God to speak to them in a different way and to have a different creative way of sharing the gospel, of getting the word out, of ministry in their own way. And I love that. It's interesting that our kids are also different and they're creative. Mm-hmm. And you want them to do that. Robbie, for instance, just did a movie called Run the Race. And, I'm giving him a little shout out here. But, that's just, it's a football, faith-based movie. But they didn't want football to be hokey in it. So since he played football, he wanted it to be really cool. But also, it's a great way to share the gospel in a faith-based, clean-cut way, but people were taking their whole baseball teams or their youth group or whatever to go see this movie because they could.
Right.
Because there's nothing that parents are going to object to, and yet then they hear the gospel in a really cool way, Mm-hmm. It's not silly. So I love that. I love their creativity, and we encourage that he's doing something different. Than we could have ever imagined. None of us are movie makers,
right.
We wouldn't even know how to do that. So I love that creativity. And our daughter, Christy, has come up with all kinds of things that she does on the field. She's helping abused women, and she just loves to speak into them because in the culture where they're ministering, women aren't valued. Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite pictures, I just love this picture and I have it in my head. I also have a copy of it, but my daughter and her little daughter, Claire, are washing the feet of a wrinkled old woman. In their country, washing feet shows that they value the person. And our precious little Claire is looking up into her face and she's just glowing because she's loving on this old wrinkled woman that nobody probably loves in her home or her country. And I could have never done that. Envisioned that.
Right.
But, they take it a step further. So you teach them these things, but then they go on and do more than you could have even imagined. So I'm really thankful for that, and that's what our hope is. We don't want them to be all the same. We want them to be the creative people that God has made, and be individuals.
Right. And, in the way that a ripple moves out, you never know what shore it's reaching to, right?
That's exactly
And so to be willing to say, I embrace God, whatever shore that
and just support them.
Right.
To be on their team and be their cheerleader. And that's what a mom does. I think it's, you're cheering them on and you're believing in them. But I think early on with our kids, that's what we do. Mm-hmm. You have the potential. God created you for a great purpose. He's got something special just for you. And if they hear that enough and they believe that and you speak that truth into their lives, they're going to believe that. No matter what the world tells them or friends, the mm-hmm. world is full of put downs. So the world is going to try to squash that. But if you tell them enough, they're going to believe that. Mm-hmm. You use the words. I talk a lot about words because the words that we say to our kids, they say that they need to hear 10 positive words for every negative word that they hear in the world. And moms are the ones that are, I think, the most able to speak truth and to speak into the lives of their kids and believe in them.
Ripple effects. Well, your ripple effects have impacted many of us through being able to watch your beautiful family, and so exciting to see all that your ministry is doing today. And I can't wait for this book to get into the hands of our listeners, Ripple Effects, and it's coming out right now. And check out PamTebow.com. Can't wait to see those ripple effects go out through the internet too as you get more technical.
Yeah, let's hope so. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks so much for being with me.
You're welcome.
We also have show notes from this and every episode, which you can find at allmomdoes.com. I'm Julie Lyles Carr on all the socials and would love to hear from you what topics you'd like to see us cover on the podcast, where you're tuning in from, all of that. So come say hi to me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest. Big thanks to Donna Toti, our amazing producer, and Rebecca Beckett. She's our content coordinator. They are the engine that gets the podcast pulled together and edited and posted to all the places each and every week. And I'm so grateful. I'll see you next time on the Modern Motherhood Podcast.